Have your grandparents ever shown you a TV show from their childhood and you realize that the family dynamics shown on TV 70 years ago are completely different from modern television? I'm your host, Maddie Hall. Today, me and my guest,
Farron Ployhar,
and Sydney Ellen,
are going to discuss how American family sitcoms have changed over time and overcome societal boundaries to develop a more diverse idea of a family.
Yeah, I think that a good topic to start with is how roles in American families have changed over time. In many American sitcoms, the characters have a specific role that dictates how they interact with the rest of the family. For example, in Good Times, the father's role is to be the sole provider of the family, which causes him to experience role exit when he is fired from his job. Role exit is exactly what it sounds like, when a person has a role that defines who they are and they leave that role in some way.
Yeah, and something that's actually very similar to that, I think, is role strain. And we see this in the Brady Bunch when, for example, their grandmother was definitely too old to enjoy going on carnival rides, so it really forced a challenge upon her to play a role as a caretaker for the children. But we see her step into the role and go on the rides, even though it's harder for her. And I think these examples are what really demonstrate how the strong relationships between family evolve and how the dynamics grow and change over time.
I think another good example would be from Everybody Loves Raymond. Raymond experiences role conflict when he must prevent his dad from driving his kids to school. This demonstrates said role conflict because although Raymond is his son, Raymond must take the authority position over his father due to his older age.
Okay, so now that we've established the importance of roles in American sitcoms, it's time to connect how different roles demonstrate the interactionalist theory. The interactionist theory is the idea that a community can thrive through social exchanges with others. I would say probably one of the most accurate examples of the interactionist theory is in Modern Family, where the plot is driven by the notion of a blended family. A blended family is when different groups of families and people with different backgrounds all come together to form one unit. And basically, when all these different people come together, there's always a really large mix of interactions that each family member can have with each other, and this creates conflicts that drives the plot further.
I think a good example of an interactionist perspective would be in Good Times. The father, James, wants the family to depend on him for money, and attempts to prevent his wife, Florida, from getting a job because he has so much pride. And their relationship is a clear demonstration of interactionist perspective.
Yeah, going back to Modern Family one more time, I think the way it really demonstrates the interactionalist theory is through the connections it makes in society. Every episode of Modern Family ends with kind of a moral message that they learn through overcoming hardships, and they learn to communicate with their family even when it's really hard. They kind of end with these lessons at the end of each show, which really demonstrates a point of view as society growing and developing. And I think it grows and develops because of the interactions held, and a lot of American sitcoms really demonstrate how things develop through the progression of their shows.
Going all the way back to the 50s and 60s in Leave It to Beaver, the mother has a very specific role of making food and doing laundry. She doesn't have a job, and her main job is the caretaker of her children and her husband. She isn't overly respected in the sitcoms. Mothers overall are seen almost as comedic relief without purposely doing so. With that being said, do you think sitcoms are still relevant, or are they something of the past, lacking relevance to today's modern families?
I think those questions really demonstrate what we're talking about in this podcast. I think even though Leave It to Beaver does not really represent how we want women to be treated today, it doesn't mean that what they have her do and what role she has as a caretaker is completely irrelevant. But I wonder what our other listeners think. Compared to Leave It to Beaver, the role of the mother in the Brady Bunch is much less limited. In the episode that we watched, Mrs. Brady plays an active role in helping her family search for Mr. Brady's missing blueprints. And she does much more than simply support the characters from the sidelines, because she actively runs with them when they find it, and she's really an active participator in all that. In some of the other shows that we watched before that, you wouldn't see the mother playing that kind of role. Also, although she is a little different than the past mothers in past sitcoms, She is still defined by many stereotypes for women back then. She is mild-mannered, and she still plays the role of the housewife by looking after the children and cleaning the kitchen and cooking. We will likely see a more dramatic representation of how American sitcoms have changed in our next example.
Yeah, I think the way family sitcoms have changed can definitely be seen through the aspect of power in a household, because I think the sitcoms really kind of push the angles of power in society. For example, in Modern Family, again, Phil and Claire in the episode we watched took equal responsibility to host a birthday party for their son. And I think that's not something we would necessarily see in Leave It to Beaver. That would be more of a role of the mother, and the father would be kind of out working. So I think it really shows the balance of power in our modern society that wouldn't be seen on shows like that. And it kind of shows how it's developed and changed over time.
That's such a good point. I think with how much, let me ask you guys, with how much the family structures we see on TV have changed, do you guys think that sitcoms have become a thing of the past? I mean, shows like Dick Van Dyke and Leave It to Beaver were recorded before color television, and while watching these shows, it often feels unfamiliar and unrelatable. For example, in Leave It to Beaver, Beaver got kicked off of the bus due to getting in a fight with another kid, and he had to write a note to the bus driver in order to be allowed back on the bus. In the modern day society, this is not how we would handle this issue. In today's world, you would expect to see the parents much more involved in communication with the counselor or the principal, and the student might not be expected to write a direct letter to the bus driver. Even though this is a lot different than how we handle things in 2023, it doesn't mean that it's irrelevant. It just shows how much life has changed since the 1950s, and it's actually really interesting to look back on how the dynamic has changed.
Yeah, so I think kind of to answer your question, since there is no basic mold for what a traditional family and the world that keeps growing and evolving, it's really hard to put that on a screen at this point without so much controversy in the modern society. So I think the audience has changed, and family sitcoms really are a thing of the past because there's just no longer a more relatable message to spread to viewers through that family perspective, because there are just so many different family perspectives. And I think since family sitcoms also focus on one bloodline families, there's a lack of inclusivity in the shows, and that also plays as to why the world has kind of strained away from those traditional husband and wife and kids TV shows.
I think that's a really good point. I think that the evolution of society has changed to be more inclusive, and so modern TV shows have a difficulty time showing the realistic representation of what a stereotypical family would look like in America now. And because there is really no longer a stereotype to follow, I think it's really hard to get that point across.
Exactly. So now that we've gone over the relevancy of family structures in American sitcoms, we need to talk about how the concept of a nuclear family plays into the most important parts of American sitcoms. For example, in Modern Family, the families are much more less traditional, and a lot more you'll see a lot of different situations in Modern Family where traditional nuclear families can't have those kind of interactions. Before the early 2000s, a nuclear family would have a working father, a housewife, and 2 or more children. Why was this such a common blueprint for so long? This plays into the functionalist perspective, which is the concept of a society being based around institutions like family, religion, and government. Before the turn of the 21st century, when laws were passed to allow interracial and same-sex marriage, people became more open-minded in general. Families were expected to consist of a much more conventional idea of a mother and father.
I think that's a really good point. I definitely say around the 90s and 2000s is when the idea of a nuclear family dynamic, I think, completely changed. There are, I think, bigger families, the idea of divorce families and joint families, multiracial families are also talked about more, and you see more into the lives of them and their problems. It's no longer a copy-paste TV shows, but different things being projected. I think that was a big step for us in history.
Yeah, I think the idea of changing the nuclear family dynamic is kind of what brought the downfall to the American family sitcoms, because there's just no longer a guideline for stereotypes to follow. and society has evolved to be more open-minded. So the idea of a traditional husband that works and mother that's a caretaker and children, that kind of family dynamic is really just a thing of the past, because there's no blueprint there's no blueprint as to what that is now, what that is to each and every different situation.
I think the look of a nuclear family wasn't the only thing that changed throughout time. I think it's important to see how authority figures have changed as well. For a starting point, I think fathers were typically portrayed as insensitive and tough. TV shows like Family Matters does a really good job of demonstrating a dad that is closed off and unavailable, more of like a sole provider than anything else, and was typically viewed as a hot-headed person and stubborn.
Also, mothers were typically portrayed as docile housekeepers whose main role in the family was to care for others and provide food and clean the house. This type of role for mothers can be seen in Good Times, where Florida's husband prohibits her from working anywhere outside of the home, despite her having a job as a maid before she married him.
Yeah, I think seeing how parents have evolved through the TV shows really demonstrates how more open-minded society has become. Shows like Modern Family really expand the limits of the other American sitcoms, because they really show different families in different situations, and they show these strong levels of communication, and it really kind of varies the different versions of what family means. I think the balance in parenting is what changed the most, and we see a more even scale of parenting with children better in Modern Family than shows like Leave It to Beaver from the 50s, because there's just such a shift in power and a shift in that responsibility over time.
Yeah, it really has changed a lot. I feel like we've talked so much about how all of these different shows portray different aspects of American society, but there are actually a lot of the ways all these shows connect. All of these shows contain messages about the importance of communication and compassion when it comes to problem solving. It's important that a family unit can come together and talk about their issues and be able to solve it with each other and not have to struggle with things alone. For example, in Leave It to Beaver, a show from the 1950s, contains concepts that in 2023 viewers can sympathize with, like a young boy needing help from his brother to write an apology letter. Although I said earlier that Leave It to Beaver can sometimes be unrelatable due to it being in black and white and having such a different way that the characters interact, there are still aspects of this show and other shows from the 1950s and 60s that demonstrate a lot of things that we still see in society today. These interactions can be really impactful and inspiring to modern audiences.
Yeah, I think it's definitely the aspiring levels of communication that they have on family sitcoms that are desired by the viewers. And I think with the progress that we make in each new century and each new representation of what a standard American family is that we watched in these episodes, I think all the shows we talked about really demonstrated how different kinds of family, like the Brady Bunch and Family Matters, are alike in the same way that they reached the audience to connect and sympathize.
I really think a good example would be the father losing his job in Good Times. And everyone was really worried about how they were going to keep living and how they were going to pay for bills or get groceries and so on.
Yeah, I think a really clear example of how American sitcoms have become more progressive over the years is the introduction of one-parent families and remarried families. Like we talked before about nuclear families, the idea of one person providing for the children or two different families coming together and combining their children was completely unheard of. Before the Brady Bunch, there was no such thing shown on TV before. And the show was actually extremely controversial for breaking the stigma around families like this. But why was this so controversial? Why is it so bad that two unhappy people can come together and create a family? Well, it's because of the importance Americans place on a nuclear family dynamic. It's sad that the stigma exists, because while watching the show, it's clear that the husband and wife come together to create a strong and healthy family that supports each other. But it's also unavoidable because Americans have a certain way they want to see, or they have certain things that they want to see on TV, and if they aren't represented, then they will get angry and they will say that it's not okay.
Yeah, I think the controversy of families that go beyond stereotypes is kind of a reason these things aren't on TV anymore today. And you make a good point. It really is sad because the representation of different families in the sitcom world is such an amazing thing. It shows such different variations of love and the depiction of what love is to every different unique family. So it's really interesting to see the development and the progression of that on screen, going to a 50s traditional married couple to a 70s remarried couple, and it really shows the progression of society and how it's grown as a whole to expand to more open-mindedness.
I think that's a really good point. I also think the emergence of non-traditional marriage families allows for a more widespread idea of what a family consists of and breaks the stereotype of a family consisting of a man, a woman, and their children. I think that there are many other ways the family dynamic can be talked about, sharing more changes and impacts. But that is all we have time to talk about.
I feel like we talked a lot about different things like the interactionalist theory, the functionalist theory, the ideas of role exit, role strain, and all of these ideas play into what we learned in sociology this year. But I think it's important to incorporate to mention that there are a lot of things shown in these shows that were really impactful and really interesting and changed a lot of the ways that probably many students in that class viewed society. And it depends on the person who saw it, but everyone probably saw one show that impacted them in a different way. I think for me, I was really impacted by Family Matters just because the dynamic of the mother and the father was so different than what I see in my family and what I've seen before. And just to see a struggling family because they don't have a job and because the father has his pride. excuse us about that. But because the father has such pride, it's just really impactful that they had those certain struggles. And I think it's really important for people to see how families work in different situations, in different cultures, in different financial groups. And I think that's all really important to society. What do you guys think?
I don't think I can agree with you, that these shows, I think, impacted many different people probably in different ways. I can share my own. I feel like Everybody Loves Raymond, when first watching it, I think we watched the first half one day, and I was kind of this is not a good show. This is I don't understand what the purpose behind this is. And I went home and I talked to my mom about it, and she was like, watch it that is your father. And definitely going back and finishing that and seeing my dad there, I was okay, I get where you're coming from.
Yeah.
So I think that even if it didn't necessarily because I have seen that before,
mm-hmm.
and that is how my family I feel acts, I definitely think it gives people a different it just gives them that opportunity to see my family was portrayed in a way, and I can relate to that, or seeing the point of view of I've never seen that before, that was actually a thing that existed, kind of thing. But
I feel Family Matters and Everybody Loves Raymond were so different. They were kind of opposites of each other in a weird way. What do you think, Sydney?
Yeah, I mean, I think the shows were both so different, but they both showed kind of a very similar message in the end.
Yeah.
Of, just really kind of showing that level of growth and communication as a family, and how that kind of grows and develops and changes through the years. And I think we really get to see that development in each one of these shows, and it each just shows such a different family in such a different situation. And that's what really reached out to me, is watching each different show, as each family was so unique and different from the other one.
Yeah, I feel the same way.
It really just kind of shows through the decades how things are different and how every situation is so unique, but the families, they stay together because that's what the show is. It's a family sitcom and everyone's happy, and that's what's kind of the best thing about it.
Yeah, I really enjoy just seeing the different shows and taking in how filmmakers created different dynamics through all the different families. I just thought that was really unique, and seeing how from Leave It to Beaver, the 1950s, it was so old school, and then going all the way to Modern Family, it was really inspiring to me, and just it reminded me that our world changes and our world is always growing, and as people, things won't always be the same, and I think that's great.
Well, I think it's been a pleasure talking to you
Thank you so much
guys.
for having us.
Thank you for having
joining me on
us.
this lovely podcast. Any last goodbyes, words.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
All right.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.